Good evening to everybody, and welcome. This is a forum on unmarried motherhood from conception to consequences. I'm Mary Jo Bain. I'm on the faculty here at the Kennedy School, and I will be moderating this forum. I suppose everyone in the room realizes that and recognizes the importance of unmarried motherhood as a increasingly important, if you will, fact about families and children in America, but also as a contentious and difficult area of concern. The facts, I think we probably know, something like a third of all births in the United States now are to women who are not married. The proportions are, of course, much greater among some groups and in some places, and that number has been rising reasonably dramatically over the last couple of decades. Unmarried motherhood as an area of concern is also obvious, whether warranted or not, and that's obviously part of what we'll be talking about here tonight. There is concern about what this trend in unmarried motherhood means for our society, means for families, and especially what it means for kids. Just as an example, a lot of the discussion around last year's welfare reform bill had to do with unmarried motherhood. The prologue to the bill deplored it and actually built in specific incentives for states to reduce the amount of unmarried motherhood. Now, I think that to understand both the fact about unmarried motherhood, the facts and the concerns, it's really important to understand the experience of unmarried motherhood, the experience from the point of view of the young mothers and their children and their families, how young women come to be unmarried mothers, how not so young women come to be unmarried mothers, what it means for them, what it means for the community, and what it means for their children. And our panel tonight will deal with those issues. Our first, I'm going to introduce all three speakers, and then we'll just go in order. Our first speaker tonight will be Melissa Ludke, who is the author of a new book, which I have here in my hand, called On Our Own: Unmarried Motherhood in America, it's just been published. Just been published, so will soon be available in your friendly stores. But Melissa's book is a study with wonderful conversations and interviews and information with unmarried mothers of two sorts. Unmarried mothers who are very young, many of whom didn't really choose to become unmarried mothers, and unmarried mothers who were older and made very conscious choices about unmarried mothers. Melissa has been a correspondent for Time magazine. She's written lots of articles, lots of cover stories focused on families and children. She's a graduate of Wellesley College, lives in Cambridge, has had fellowships of various sorts, and is an unmarried mother. Following Melissa, we will hear from Elizabeth Bartholet, who is the Morris Wasserstein Public Interest Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and the author of Family Bonds, Adoption and the Politics of Parents. Betsy is an expert and has spent lots of time looking at issues of adoption and parenthood, and will come at it from that perspective. Third, we'll hear from Carol Gilligan, who is a professor of education at the School of Education, and now the Patricia Graham something or other.
Chair in Gender Studies.
The holder of the Patricia Graham Chair in Gender Studies, a first for Harvard University, established in honor of Pat Graham and now held by Carol Gilligan. As I think most of you know, Carol has been doing research for many years on the psychology of women, the development of women, the extent to which women's experience and development is different from that of men, and I suppose the book we all know is In a Different Voice, which so many of us have gotten so much from. So that's the order in which we'll be. We should have plenty of time for discussion and questions after that. So, Melissa.
feel it's a little strange to be in this company tonight because actually when I was a student at Harvard not too many years ago, Carol was a professor of mine, Betsy was a professor of mine, Mary Jo might as well have been a professor of mine. I took a course from David Ellwood and we read most of the studies that she and David Ellwood collaborated on, so I feel like she was in some ways an absent professor of mine. So I'm a little bit daunted by the company I'm in, but let me begin as the author of this book and try to share with you some of the things I've learned in the writing of it. I'd like to begin my remarks about this much talked about but very little understood topic of unmarried motherhood by sharing the words of an adolescent mother. "You have a baby," she said, "because you think it will make things different." Indeed, no event so profoundly changes or makes different a person's life as does the experience of becoming a parent. Nor does any other event impact so directly on the future course and consequences of another's life, that of the child. Today, as we approach the 21st century, nearly 1 in every 3 American children is being born to parents who are not married, and a majority of these children will spend many of their vitally important years of development, key years in which their emotional, educational, social, and moral beings are created and nurtured, living in a home in which their mother is present, but their birth father is not. Tonight we're here, as Mary Jo Bain said, to talk about the reasons for and the implications of this emerging trend in family formation. This opportunity offers a welcome change from the customary dialogue, no, make that diatribe, that most of us are accustomed to hearing when the topic of unwed mothers is raised. Women who become mothers without becoming wives are often talked about by political leaders, but rarely listened to and seldom invited into male-dominated discourses about their lives. During the recent debate on welfare reform, no target was more politically convenient nor safer than young mothers and out-of-wedlock births. Yet, did we as a nation learn anything about the circumstances or the decision-making that is driving so many adolescents to become mothers at ages when childbearing ought to be the furthest thing from their minds? I would argue that we did not. Even older unwed mothers, those for whom government plays no critical role in their family's support, are portrayed as male-bashing, family-destroying women whose selfish desire for a child is irresponsible, misguided, and done with little consideration for the child's best interests. I bet there are many people, probably not many in this room, but many people nonetheless, who believe, as Dan Quayle charged in his speech about Murphy Brown, that women such as me, who are raising children on their own, simply wake up one morning and say to ourselves, "Oh, I think I'll make a lifestyle choice today. I'll have a baby on my own." That it took me 9 years to think through this issue and decide to bring a child into my life. That I did so only after a relationship which I'd hoped would lead to marriage and children ended over this issue of having children. That I did so only with the support of family and friends. That I did so with the knowledge that I'm able to offer the essential components of a developmental foundation that my child will need to function to her highest potential. All of these are important but inconvenient factors which are often ignored in our customary discourse. I devoted several years of my life to listening to girls and women who became mothers without being wives, so that I could deepen our conversation about them and their family lives. As one columnist recently put it, and she's right, my goal is to, quote, complicate what is presently an oversimplified portrayal of single motherhood. I also wanted these women's experiences to highlight for us factors that enter into their decision-making. First, in having the baby. Second, in deciding to raise the child on her own. And third, in coping with the absence of a partner and her child's absence of a daddy. And I hope that women's insights would help us to better understand the complex interplay between personal lives and decision-making and community dynamics, which after all have such great influence not only on whether, when, and how women begin families of their own, but how well their children will fare and why. After years of coming to know many unwed mothers very, very well, and bouncing back and forth between the youngest of them, the adolescents, and the oldest, the so-called Murphy Browns. What surprised me most was the territory of common ground over which many of them walked on their way to and through motherhood. Let me describe a bit of this shared territory. Perhaps the widest ground these mothers share is found in the experience, distilled, of course, by their differing perspectives, of what it means and what it takes to fulfill community and societal expectations of becoming and being a woman. For younger girls, particularly those who are growing up in poor communities, feeling disconnected from family members, and lacking a trusting relationship with adults, traditional pathways used to make the transition from girlhood to being a woman can appear blocked at a very early age. Most girls who do become pregnant and go on to become mothers are already failing in school before their pregnancy occurs. For them, dreams about or a clear vision of a future in which becoming a woman will be defined by other accomplishments have all but disappeared. Life isn't what dreams suggest it can be. Life is, as one teen mother told me, simply what happens. And pregnancy, if not consistently protected against, is one of the ways in which life happens to too many of these girls. As psychologist Judith Musick, who has written extensively about poor teenage moms, observes, quote, "Motherhood offers these girls a ready-made role with ready-made functions, what to be, what to do," end of quote. Thus, motherhood can become a seductive route by which girls see themselves being transformed into women. Again and again, teenage mothers told me how prepared they felt they were to become mothers. Interestingly, they don't have the same view about becoming wives, at least not yet. As I listened more closely to what these girls were telling me, I began to understand that from a teenager's perspective, having a baby suggests the welcomed possibility of gaining some new measure of control over her undirected life, even if her view is illusionary. Motherhood can appear to offer her the chance to define herself anew. To get married suggests just the opposite. Marriage seems to offer the likelihood of being defined by someone else, thus surrendering this rare opportunity for self-redefinition, or of ceding control to the baby's father. Many of these girls' baby-making partners are several years older, and often they have controlled these girls' lives prior to the baby's being born. Once a baby arrives, girls' tolerance for demands she might have once agreed to diminishes. As teen moms told Yale's Dr. Bonnie Leadbeater, quote, "Why get involved with someone who will just tell me what to do?" End of quote. In general, Leadbeater found that these young moms want fathers to participate in their children's lives, but not to control theirs or claim command of decision-making. Among older women, unwillingness to cede control or to enter into a marriage simply for the sake of being married with a man who will not be a true partner in family matters has to some extent reshaped the ways in which these women, with incomes that are adequate to support a family on their own, evaluate their options for having children. Many married mothers of my generation complain among their friends about the unequal burdens of parenting and how their, quote, partners turn out to be anything but what that word implies. Without a man as part of her daily life, a mother's relentless demands of taking care of children, nurturing her career, and taking care of her husband would be reduced by 1/3. In hearing such complaints, women who aren't married but are contemplating parenthood sometimes decide that not having a husband seems tolerable, whereas not having a child is not. As further justification for deciding to begin their families alone, women suggest that in an era when 40% of all first marriages end in divorce, with potentially devastating consequences for children, at the very least they can give their offspring homes without parental conflict, something that is found again and again to be a cause of behavioral and academic problems for children. Also, like their younger counterparts, for older women, motherhood, even when done outside of marriage, can be a way to fulfill what society expects of them as women, and what many of them come to expect of and want for themselves. Jean Safer, the author of a book called Beyond Motherhood, Choosing a Life Without Children, explains how her decision to not have a child, quote, violates the norms of feminine conduct, end of quote. Without motherhood, women who have been working in professions still dominated by men and defined by their masculine characteristics can find it difficult to fully express their femininity. Motherhood, even without marriage, at least brings with it the comfort of feminine expression. It used to be that spinsterhood was the mark of a woman's discontented life. Now the absence of motherhood seems to have displaced this earlier paradigm of women's deviance. Cultural messages also bombard women with reminders that to express themselves fully as women, they need to be mothers. Who can forget the magazine covers in which obviously successful women are carrying a briefcase in one hand, but never leave behind that baby on the other hip? One mother in my book who has struggled with feelings of deviance throughout her life, particularly as a single woman, told me how motherhood has transformed her. Quote, now I have the right accoutrement, a baby, to prove I am a real woman. And she went on to tell me, it is gratifying to me to do something that society approves of, even if society doesn't approve of the way I do it. End of quote. Echoes of this theme of deviance can be picked up in conversations with the younger mothers. There are now communities in our country in which young parenting and unwed motherhood are sadly the normal experience for girls who grow up there. For a girl to secure the personal fortitude to work hard not to have a baby can mean that she will find herself walking down unfamiliar paths, heading in a direction that she worries will end in loneliness and discontent. There are few role models in these girls' daily lives who present accessible alternatives to early motherhood, or who can offer believable assurances about the benefits for them of postponing childbirth. Messages about how their adult lives will be better if they don't have a child right now aren't easily verified by experiences they observe around them. Instead, young girls who are losing hope for their future think about what it is they can be. One possibility they know they can achieve is to be a mother. As the director of a program for parenting teens told me, to have a baby gives these girls a purpose. In concluding my remarks, I'd like to return now to the teen statement with which I began. You have a baby because you think it will make things different. One difference is that by having a baby, a teenager believes she will no longer be looked at as a girl, neglected, ignored, unlistened to, but rather will take on the roles of motherhood and thus successfully become a woman. What these girls taught me in the course of writing this book is that motherhood and the absence of marriage are the consequences of our societal neglect, not so much of what goes on below the waist, but all that happens above the waist in the lives of these young girls. It is from this perspective that I am now beginning work with the Girl Scouts here in Boston to develop an approach to pregnancy prevention that uses the words and experiences of young mothers in my book as a launching pad for mentor discussion, group activities designed to offer girls new and expanded visions of the possibilities of women's lives. Ask the girls themselves, those between the ages of 11 and 15, what they need to help them negotiate the turbulent waters of adolescence. And they will tell us that an ideal approach by adults would revolve around having, quote, someone to talk to about problems and feelings. I remember asking Sarah Brown, who directs the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy, to tell me what she thought were the most effective approaches to preventing teen births. Her answer might surprise a lot of you. The Girl Scouts, she said. They learned years ago that you start with 8- and 9-year-olds and carry through. I don't know if Girl Scouts had developmental psychologists working with them, she said, but they had an intuitive understanding that if you want to make a difference in a 17-year-old girl's life, you start when they are 7. I might argue you start a lot earlier than 7, but 7's not bad. Time will tell if the curriculum based on my book will add effective preventive dimensions to what Girl Scouts already do. But how much more productive our discourse on all of this would be if instead of blaming, demeaning, and scolding these girls, we would get to the job which adults were always supposed to do. That is, to take responsibility for safeguarding the well-being of the children among us. Thank you.
So I'm here as a representative of Melissa's older single parenting group. Without having planned my life this way early on, seem to have had a lot of experience with unmarried motherhood. I produced one child the traditional way through marriage, intercourse, childbirth. He's now 29. I raised him from the age of 2 as a single parent, single divorced parent. I adopted 2 children 9 and 12 years ago as a single parent from the start. So I live with these issues a lot. I want to start with a couple of personal reflections on some of the issues in Melissa's book. One, she writes a lot about the challenge for both these groups of unmarried mothers, the younger group, the older group, of being the single parent. I come at the single parenting from what I realize is an extraordinarily privileged position, and I actually chose not to adopt until I got tenure at Harvard Law School, because I didn't want to do it without tenure, and I wasn't sure I'd get tenure if I was in the process of adopting. So I've got a job where even if I mess up significantly, I'm told, and I count on the fact that they won't throw me out and stop the income. I have extraordinary flexibility in my hours. There's a lot of ways in which it's an amazingly privileged form of single parenting. And I feel that I basically work around the clock and 7 days a week to do what I hope is a good job of raising these kids. I am quite amazed at what a challenge it is. And that I guess takes me to my second point. But before I get to the second personal reflection, I've also developed, in the course of realizing what a challenge this is, a lot more awareness, I guess, of what it must be like for 14-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds who are struggling without any of the privileges I had in terms of growing up and without the privileges I have in terms of my job, et cetera. You know, a lot more understanding of their situation and how overwhelmingly difficult it is. I've also developed some new ideas about this issue of older as against younger parenting. When I gave birth to and raised my first, now 29-year-old child, I had to figure it out here, 28 years old when I gave birth to Derek. And in Melissa's terms, and even in the terms then that we talked about, I was something of an older mother then. And I look back now and think I was a baby. I didn't begin to be old enough at 28 to raise a child. I think I'm just way better parent now, and I think that because at the age of 28 I was struggling, and I had at 30 and at 32 and 5 struggling, and you know, maybe I'm a late bloomer, later I hope than many, but I was struggling with working out my own life, identity, career, relationships with men, with a whole lot of stuff that I feel that I don't struggle with now. And I just feel I'm more of a grown-up now in terms of having the capacity to really throw a huge amount of my life energy into these kids and their lives and who they're going to be, which I just didn't have at 28. And I have trouble imagining that even though others might have been a better parent than I at the age of 28, I have trouble imagining how somebody at 14, 15, 18 can have that maturity. You don't want them to have it. You want them to be having a chance to grow up. Now, like Melissa, my life has become an amazingly merged thing where personal and professional are incredibly interwoven. And through the adoption of my now 9 and 12-year-old children, I became intensely interested in issues of parenting and how society shapes choices surrounding parenting. So I want to, in the limited moments that I've been assigned here to talk to you, to raise at least 3 areas in which I've thought a lot in terms of my past work and my present work about policy questions and issues surrounding unmarried motherhood. So the first, I want to raise some questions about how our society shapes parenting decision-making about whether to become a parent and how to become a parent by the relatively privileged older intending parenthood group that Melissa talks about in her book. So who are these people I'm talking about here? I'm talking about people who are both fertile and infertile, have decided either for reasons of age or infertility to pursue reproductive technology or adoption, or think about different alternative parenting options. I'm talking about gay and lesbian men and women who are thinking about single parenting or coupled parenting, but not married parenting in our society. How do we now shape decision-making? A lot of what I've looked at in terms of my own work is that as I see it, if you look at the combination of policies, laws, absence of laws surrounding decision-making about parenting by these groups, what you see is an overwhelming pressure that we put on people in our society to pursue procreation at all costs and not to consider parenting in the form of adoption, not to consider taking on kids who already exist and need homes. So part of what has interested me is, why do we do this? Why do we say to singles, gay or straight, who are thinking about, interested in parenting, we will subsidize childbirth if you go and get pregnant. If you need artificial reproductive technology in order to get pregnant, we will subsidize that, mandated insurance coverage here in Massachusetts for any form of reproductive technology for as long as you use it. But if you consider giving a home to a kid who needs one, first of all, as a single older, we will say to you, you're close to unfit. At least you're at the very bottom of our barrel in terms of the people we might allow to parent. If you're lesbian, you're seriously unfit, and we might allow it, but we'll make it very, very difficult for you. We'll make it expensive. We'll set up barriers, emotional and financial, to your becoming a parent that way. So I have a lot of questions about the social policy that is pushing people in terms of decision-making to procreate at all costs and to stay away from giving kids who exist and need homes those homes. Second set of questions that I'm interested in is how we shape parenting decision-making by the younger women that Melissa's talking about, the people who get pregnant accidentally or maybe on purpose, but often with a lot of ambivalence about whether they want to be parents, and people who I would argue, and I think Melissa says, should be ambivalent and should be questioning more than they may be whether they should take on the responsibilities of parenting even if they are already pregnant. How do we shape those people's decision making? If you look at the statistics on unwed teen pregnancies, 97 to 98% of those young women, when they give birth, choose, which I would put in quotation marks, to keep their children, not to surrender them for adoption. Now, we can look at that statistic and say this is really good compared to the bad old days when we used to coerce that choice and we stigmatized single parenting and we forced those young women to give up children. And I certainly am not arguing for a return to the bad old days, but I am arguing that the choice to keep is not a true choice, that I think we condition that choice by making it unnatural to surrender a child, and I think we condition that choice by making the adoption process for birth mothers one that is unpleasant and demeaning and scary and threatening in terms of their felt love for their child if they're asked, for example, to turn over their child to an agency with no knowledge of where that child might go or with what family. So I think there are ways. I'm to my third point, which is going to be my last. I question that the societal pressures that are put on decision-making by the group of women who are pregnant, but I would argue a higher percentage than now are opting to surrender their child should be. And I question the, quote, voluntary quality of the choice that they're making now. A third set of questions I have is, what do we do about parenting by young singles when it doesn't work out, and doesn't work out for the children in some very serious ways? What my current work has to do with is child abuse and neglect. Child abuse and neglect, whether it takes place in the biological family or in foster care or in the process of bouncing back and forth between the two. Anybody who looks at the issue of abuse and neglect intelligently today says that, overwhelming predictive factors for abuse or neglect are single, young, and poor. I mean, that is, now this is not to say, obviously, that the young single mothers are, majority of them are guilty of abuse and neglect of their children. Not true. But if you look at the abuse and neglect issue, where it's happening to a very significant degree is in young, unmarried, impoverished families. Right now, what do we do? To a significant degree, we leave kids in families where they are subject to very serious levels of abuse and neglect, or at best, we remove them temporarily to foster care and then bounce them back and forth from foster care to the biological family. When I say bounce back and forth, the figures now show that out of kids removed from families on the basis of abuse and neglect, of those who were removed and then returned to the biological family, a third will be removed again on the basis of renewed abuse and neglect. The policy questions that I'd like to raise in terms of this third set of issues, or the policy suggestions that at least I'd like to make, and this will take 1 minute. I'd like to argue that we should do, as I think Melissa argues, a much better job at preventing pregnancy in the first place by the younger mothers, both for their sake and for the sake of the kids that they might otherwise produce. I'd like to argue that we should encourage the adoption choice if we fail to prevent. And I'd like to argue that we should be much more ready to intervene in the lives of the young mothers and fathers, if there are fathers on the scene, or boyfriends, in cases where abuse and neglect is identified. Intervene either in the form of serious home visiting programs where true significant support services are offered to these young women for the first 5 years of the child's life. And I would argue that we should be more ready to intervene in the form of removing children and putting them into adoptive homes at a time when their lives can be salvaged and before they get destroyed. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here and celebrate this wonderful book and be part of this conversation. I just want to start by emphasizing this is really a conversation-changing book in the sense that Melissa brings the voices of the women into this conversation And I think it's completely different to talk about women who are having children without being married, and to talk with these women to understand what the experience is in their own terms, because frankly, any social policy that's going to have any effect has to be a policy that's in relationship with the women. And I think, I'll get to this in a minute, not listening to these women is probably one of the biggest causes of, first of all, the girl's pregnancy, and also a way of maintaining a set of social policies that are, actually, Mary Jo is not part of this panel, but she'd be the person. I mean, we are a society that provides less support to children and to mothers and to families, and that's partly because women's voices haven't been a vital part of the social conversation. So I want to really celebrate this extraordinary work that went into an area where, in the words of many of the girls who I talked to, nobody listens. And actually not only invited women's voices, but created the resonances that made it possible for women to believe that they could speak from experience and be heard, because in the absence of that kind of resonance, women simply don't speak. So I think this is a landmark book and a very important change in the conversation. The second thing I want to say is sort of double some of the things that Betsy and Melissa have said. With my colleagues Jill McLean-Taylor and Amy Sullivan, we did a project in a large urban public school with a group of girls who were labeled in 7th and 8th grade to be, quote, at risk for early motherhood and school dropout. Now, one of the things that we found, we published the results of our study in a book called Between Voice and Silence. And first of all, our own, two things to say about this. First, that what we found, we did a longitudinal study, and some of these, quote, at-risk girls, in fact, did become mothers and drop out of school. Those two were almost always associated with each other. And others didn't. The majority didn't. And the crucial factor in those girls who did not end up becoming mothers before leaving high school was the presence in their life of somebody who listened, some relationship, some connection with other people, that we could predict early pregnancy and school dropout by a year or two by the girl's description of losing her relationships. I mean, so the sense of prevention and the vital role of relationships in prevention was very, very clear. My favorite quote from that study, it's on the book jacket, is from a girl whom we called Anna, who's 16 years old and Portuguese American, and she says, "My aunt, she's crazy, she listens." Meaning, often girls found that the women who listened were women who were labeled crazy because they listened to the girls. The second thing I have to say, and this is a study that came out, it was in the Times the summer before last, is the very strong association between girls who become pregnant as teenagers and girls who have been sexually abused. And so also unmarried teenage mothers is often a euphemism for girls who are victims of statutory rape, because the abusers are generally, in a majority of the cases, not teenagers. The fathers are not teenagers, but adult men. So there's part of me that thinks this conversation we're having here tonight really should be, in part, a conversation about fatherhood. We could have a conversation about unmarried fatherhood. That is, fathers who are not married, who may or may not be in any relationship with their children, and also the kind of really revisiting what it means to be a parent in this society, which is very economically unfriendly to parenthood in general. I mean, it makes it very hard for anyone to be a responsible parent and have a job in this society. So the final things that I want to say is that when I wrote a book called In a Different Voice, it was about how the inclusion of women's voices in what was called the human conversation I mean, the quote, human conversation was a sort of ongoing conversation that did not include women's voices. I mean, it was a conversation among a very small and unrepresentative group of men. And so to the extent that those people talked about motherhood or families, I mean, it was a very odd conversation in a way. My point about in a different voice is women's voices coming into this conversation was going to change the conversation. It would be a different voice. It would be a different conversation. And so it will change the conversation about what it means to be a mother, because it will change the conversation about what it means to be a father, because there'll be more than, I mean, it will be a voiced conversation. What families are. I mean, and I think we're in the middle of an enormously changing conversation at this time. I love the title of Melissa's book, On Our Own. I should say, since everybody talked about their experience, I happen to be a married mother. I'm sort of like a relic, I guess. My children have grown. But what's interesting to me is the old conversation was held in place by a view of mothers as selfless. I love that term, selfless, without a self, meaning without a voice. That the good mother was someone who had no voice, which is, I mean, it's really, when you think about it, it makes no sense. How can you be a good mother if you're not present? How can you be present if you're not speaking? So it really means we have to fundamentally reconstruct the image of who a mother is. And when mothers are present, women are present in motherhood with voices, and I think this is the significance of the older women in Melissa's book, because these are women with an effective social voice and an effective political voice, like Betsy. And then women have a lot to say about the conditions under which it is desirable or even possible to responsibly raise a child. And those include conditions where there isn't violence in the home, and where there is economic support. And so I really feel we're at a time where the issues that can be discussed among women and men are a very different set of issues because of women's voices being part of this conversation. And I really think in more than some of the things that are talked about in the public policy, the real question for me is whether we as a society with a majority of women voters are going to put into effect social policies that support children, that support parents, any parents who want to have children, so that it's possible for people as much as possible to be loving parents. That's basically what we're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, I can see about 10 minutes. It's fine. Would you just announce that I have to leave?
Yeah. Carol has to leave in a few minutes, but she can stay for some questions. I just wanted to invite Carol, if you had anything to add on from your own work, as well as reflecting on Melissa's and Betsy's on the kind of what we should do question.
I thought I said. I mean, I think I think we know now how to prevent girls from having babies before they're ready in any serious sense to become mothers of young children. And it has to do with, first of all, really working very hard to prevent sexual abuse. I mean, girls don't have babies on their own. I mean, I think I don't want to just focus on the girls. Let's focus on the adult men who are often the fathers of these girls' babies. That's one thing. Secondly, in our work, a relationship in which a girl feels she can speak and be heard was the consistent factor associated with not early motherhood and school dropout. That's actually true for boys as well. I mean, the latest studies of adolescents show the protective factor is a relationship. But I have to say that one of the things we found when we asked girls about relationships that were important in their lives, where they felt they could speak and be heard, they named aunts or sometimes, older siblings. No one named teachers. So I think we have to really think about how we can encourage teachers to be more in relationship with the students who they're teaching, and that means really rethinking the position of women in schools who often are voiceless, like mothers have been. So those are the prevention things. And the second final thing is that girls at around 11 and 12, including our at-risk girls, are rather outspoken and resilient and often very clear about what's going on. And that's an enormous opportunity for prevention to join that strength and clarity at that age. So middle school is a vital time for prevention programs. And finally, I mean, I think a big implication here is women have effective political voices. And that's alarming everybody. I mean, you know, nobody's talking about the fact that in the last 2 elections, women elected the president in this country. If not for the women's vote, Clinton wouldn't be in the White House. So we're living in a time where people are aware of women's effective political voice, and I think this is an issue where women can, in fact, if we start to speak on our own from our experience about what's necessary to raise children, that's a very important political voice in this country, and I would not like to see this discussion go on without thinking about how this, I think it started with Roe v. Wade. It's now in terms of changing statistics on marriage and family, that when women's voices become part of the conversation about children, that it will be a different conversation. So that's what I think.
Let me invite questions from the audience. There's a microphone on each side. If you have a question, you have to rise, go to the microphone, identify yourself, and ask questions of whoever.
Hi, my name is Mona Miller. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Women's Caucus here at the Kennedy School. I'd like to thank you for coming tonight. And my previous life, I worked for National Planned Parenthood for a number of years, and have struggled with these issues for so long. And I was back this summer, and there was some new polling information that had been done by a research organization, a bunch of the pro-choice organizations, and got together to poll young women, perhaps novelly. I think we could do a lot more of that as a movement, but there was a hardening to some degree of attitudes, it seemed, that perhaps the AIDS messages had resonated in some way, suggesting that you do the crime, you do the time kind. There were quotes very similar to that there was a real toughening. And in a way, there's an opportunity there that, as you say, young women are taking the initiative and the leadership and the opportunity for self-assertion through that. But I was wondering if you, Ms. Ludke and Carol, as well as Ms. Bartolet, could comment a little bit more on the changing attitudes of young women, whether they've internalized this potential power that they have and are perhaps exhibiting it in a somewhat less than socially desirable way.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think I'd pick up somewhat from what Carol said about the notion that a lot changes in girls' lives during this period of time between, say, about the ages of 11 and 15. I mean, I take a lot of this from my readings of Carol's work and from my listening to her over the years. But you know, I don't quite understand what you mean by sort of a hardening. I'm not quite sure what that means in that question. But I would say that one of the things that Carol's work points to, and what she just alluded to, is that if we can find a way to take the incredible strength and resilience that girls bring into their early adolescence, and yet give them the experiences they say they want, which is a trusting relationship, a mentored relationship, a place to go when the storms around them get too difficult, but then again, not crowding them so much that they feel as though they can't have this expression or this sense of self-definition in their lives. It's, you know, it's a bit of a tricky territory. I was going to add, when Mary Jo was raising the question to Carol earlier, that another very successful program in the whole host of issues that surrounds teenage pregnancy, such as school dropout, use of alcohol, use of drugs, Big Sisters is another program that its own evaluations of it show consistently seem to have one of the best track records in this. So I think if your question is there, I think the opportunity is there to take the strength that girls bring into adolescence, to nurture it by giving them what they say they want, which is this trusting relationship that they can count on to be there, a place that they feel safe to discuss their problems and their feelings. And frankly, we don't do a very good job of that at this point. Several of the girls in my book talk about their own experiences, and Carol's made the point that teachers, simply perhaps are overwhelmed by so much right now that they just feel they can't take this on, and frankly, disruptive girls are probably the last thing that they want to try to cope with. But several of the girls in my book who talk about getting pregnant and having children, in fact, also talk about how no one even cared whether they were in school or not. No one noticed. No one listened. They would be put through the same courses year after year. I mean, they were already doing poorly. And several of the other young girls, after they became parents, what happens after they become parents? They get noticed a lot more. They get put into individualized classrooms. They suddenly get much more one-on-one attention with teachers. And some of those same girls started doing very well in school. Because they had some connection of their education to this purpose, that's talked about. They knew they now had this child. So, it's such a shame that we can't see these needs early in their lives, that it doesn't take them producing a baby or becoming pregnant for them to get medical care, for example. I mean, they get medical care because the child needs prenatal care, not because they matter in terms of showing up at a clinic. They don't. So these messages that we keep sending to them are very, very confusing and very damaging. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm a little thrown by the notion of this hardening. I'm not quite sure.
Well, I guess what I was trying to say was that in some ways, it's really heartening to see young women saying, hey, you've got an obligation to try to prevent teenage pregnancy or prevent AIDS, or you've got the power to do this kind of thing. But the response seems to be that young women, this was 16 to 25, as a result, we're expecting more of one another, and that somehow perhaps that was resulting in an appearance of failing to live up to others' expectations, et cetera. It was just an interesting phenomenon in this study, so I was interested in your comment. Thank you.
Yeah, Mary Jo?
Carol or Betsy, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I guess I'd like to comment on some combination of that question and Mary Jo's earlier question. If we're thinking about what to do about all this in some global sense, I guess I have one somewhat despairing reaction, which is that to really deal with the problem, we got to create a just society. I mean, that what you've got is young girls, too many of them, overwhelming numbers of them, growing up in a world in which they understand themselves to have no opportunities, and in which they grew up without loving, nurturing parenting, and in which they look to a baby as the opportunity for a loving relationship that they've never had. And perhaps some misguided and to some degree guided sense that it's an opportunity for something. And we got to recognize that there's some realism to what they're doing and deciding. And so, my despair comes from the fact that I don't see our country moving in the direction of really facing up to, what do our center cities look like, and what are problems of injustice, and why are the poor, as I understand it, still getting poorer, not taking advantage of the stock market or whatever. It's, so, and without solving that problem, I mean, it seems to me we got to say, well, maybe we're not going to solve that problem because I don't see our society solving it. So I think we've got to think about, so then what do we do? What do we do to see if, given this world that we've got to predict is going to go on for a while, we can't prevent some of these pregnancies, get, more kids into loving, nurturing situations, provide some better mentors. But, to look to the school system when these young women making these decisions are, most of them growing up in neighborhoods that are absolutely devastated, where the schools are overwhelmed, where the schools may have some heroic figures, but they're dealing with, overwhelmingly impoverished families and conditions. It's, it's pretty scary. So Mary Jo, go back to government and
right?
clean up the society.
I was such
I
a
just want to
success
say
when I
one
was
quick thing, which is I don't know, I wasn't sure either whether what you meant by hardening, but I'm a little suspicious about whether when girls get a voice, they're seen to be hardening, you know?
Yeah.
And that in part because people often don't like what they have to say. And I don't know if that's what you meant, but the language that comes when women start speaking is often very negative and implying that for a woman to be a person is not to be, quote, a good woman, and certainly then not to be a good mother. And it's so clear that the opposite is true. I mean, it's so clear, but it's so radical for a woman who is a mother to be fully present and have an effective political voice. And I think that that's really the hopeful place that I would start from in terms of this conversation. I also want to reiterate this, what I said before, which is this finding, it's not my research, but that teenage pregnancy is in close to maybe half of the cases a euphemism for statutory rape. And so I think we need to talk about who are the fathers of these children, and that they are not, for the most part, teenagers, rather than talking about the motivation of the women for having a baby.
And Mary Jo, I'd just like to add one thing, because if we were to listen outside of this room to sort of a very generalized conversation about this topic, and in our political arena itself, it would often go like this. I mean, the problem right now facing us in terms of adolescent pregnancy is illegitimacy. Illegitimacy is the issue, implying that if we solve the illegitimacy by somehow putting in the magic bullet again of marriage, that we will have solved the social problems that are arising out of these pregnancies. That is the way the sort of logic of the argument now goes. And I think what I'm suggesting in my book, and what I've suggested in op-ed pieces, is that marriage is no longer a silver bullet, if it ever was. We have to get beyond the argument of calling it illegitimate and thinking that that's where we start this discussion. So, sorry.
Excuse me, I have the class.
I want to thank Carol for being with us. She has to go to class, which we all know to be a legitimate excuse for leaving her.
My name is Rachel Flynn, and I sponsored 2 black girls in D.C. and helping their families with money to raise them, and just recently put them in private school. And I was wondering if you know the statistics on private school versus public, and does that impact pregnancy? And
I surely don't.
I don't know any statistics off the top of my head, but I think that one of the statistics that drives it most of all is the poverty of families and the poverty of communities in which those individuals live. And so very often, since we do not yet have vouchers that go from public coffers into private schools, one usually can make the equation that those who are growing up in the poorest of families probably aren't sending their kids to private schools, and those in the poorest communities often don't necessarily have that choice as well. That I don't have statistics for you, but it would generally speak to the fact that those who are in the public school system probably have a higher percentage of teen pregnancy.
Hi, my name is Karen McGuire. Actually, I wanted to play a little bit of devil's advocate on some of the information that was discussed this evening. Unfortunately, Ms. Gilligan left, but a study at the Urban Institute found that of births to girls, 8% could have been prosecuted under statutory rape. So in other words, it counters the idea that most of these fathers are, kind of older predators. And the researchers actually got hate mail when they got this study published, because a lot of DAs were running platforms on how great it will be to cut down on teenage pregnancy by going after these fathers.
Except, let me just add one thing to that. I know she's not here, but the Guttmacher Institute has done a lot of work in this. And although the fathers of the actual children may not be such a high percentage, many of these girls prior to the pregnancy in which they then have children have experienced sexual abuse by older men previously during their childhood. So I think if you look at the experience of sexual abuse in their lives and not directly equated to this one pregnancy, you will probably find a much greater number. But
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. And then the other issue is actually on the abuse and neglect and the young parents. My knowledge of abuse and neglect statistics says that, especially in the urban areas where you have the concentrations of poverty, oftentimes it's neglect And I had been a foster care caseworker, and so I actually saw the deeper end where it was more than that. But so in a lot of these cases, it's not that these problems are irreversible, that a lot of these families can be worked with. And then I guess the other issue of getting back to the sexual abuse part was that I wanted to know if we could clarify the different decision points in this process, because we're kind of lumping together a little bit sexual activity and pregnancy and births. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about resiliency in terms of decision to engage in sexual activity or to engage in a protected sexual activity, and then the decision to go ahead and be a mother, and kind of what factors into those decision processes.
Betsy, do you want to start on that one?
Well, I'd like to talk about the neglect issue, and actually, since I was thinking about that, I didn't listen well enough to the next issue. So anyway, let me address the neglect issue, because there is a lot of, I mean, there's a big argument in the world of folk talking about abuse and neglect issues over whether we do under-intervention or over-intervention, whether the state is too reluctant to step in and remove kids on the basis of abuse and neglect, whether it's too eager to step in and is stepping in relatively minor cases. And one of the arguments that gets made by folks who think we're doing over-intervention is, hey, a majority of these cases are just neglect cases. My own sense from everything that I have read and heard in the last, basically year that I've been spending kind of trying to seriously look into this area is that in today's CPS, Child Protection Services, child welfare world, the system is so overstressed. There is such an escalating number of reports of abuse and neglect. The foster care population has gone up by, 72% in the last decade. We've got 500,000 kids in foster care now. The system is kind of bursting at the seams. My sense from sort of a lot of different data is that the overwhelming majority of the abuse and so-called neglect cases involve situations in which kids are not experiencing loving, nurturing parenthood. Now, one statistic I just throw out in terms of this claim I'm making is, again, from the best data people have, which is basically lousy, the best informed people seem to think that somewhere between 80 and 95% of the CPS caseload, the people who are families whose kids are either in foster care or the families where they're being sort of monitored in some sense by the child welfare system, 80 to 95% of those families involve, one or two drug abusing parents. Now, I mean, I spent, a decade of my life working with people who were either drug abusing or were in rehabilitation and trying to do everything I could to knock down barriers to their rehabilitation. I'm a total believer in treatment and rehabilitation and people who've got drug problems having a chance in life. But my own sense from my own experiences is that if you've got a serious drug abuse problem, you're about as far from the capacity to be a loving, nurturing parent as you can be. And I think the overwhelming majority of the so-called neglect cases are not what some people portray them as, which is these are just dirty home cases where, social workers are rushing in and out of their own sense of, morality and middle-class standards removing kids. I think if, we went out and looked at the neglect cases, you would see cases in which kids' chance to grow up thinking, being able to be students at school, being able to have normal emotional relationships are very low based on the absence of nurturing. I think you see, a lot of what you see when kids grow up in orphanages in terms of the chance these kids have in life. So I just don't believe that the fact we term these cases neglect cases means much. I mean, it's also true that most people say most of the families where they're are they could be categorized as neglect or abuse, or it's somewhat haphazard how it gets categorized. But I just think the overwhelming majority of these cases are very serious cases.
Melissa, do you want to speak to the second part of the question?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think you can sort of look at sort of a cascading level in terms of the first question of, who are having sexual activity. And again, you will find that more often than not, those who are beginning sexual activity earlier are the girls who are coming from poor communities, who are coming from families that are fractured in some way, coming from girls who are sort of disconnected from their community and sort of from their life, the girls I described earlier. However, and that said, I mean, again, this sort of cascading effect, once a pregnancy occurs among girls, adolescent girls, you will also find that the abortion rate is higher among those who come from higher income communities and higher income families. That is, girls who are poor are the ones who tend to continue the pregnancies at a greater rate. And then you will also find that among those who continue their pregnancies and become birth mothers, amongst the very few who choose to give up their children, those girls also usually come from higher income families and are usually doing better in school and sort of have a sense of their own life being interrupted or being transformed by this experience in a way that they don't think is right for them or the child. So that's generally speaking. I don't have the exact percentages.
Hi, my name's Bridget Neal. I have a couple of questions. The first thing that I wanted to ask is...
I think maybe given the number of people that want to ask questions, why don't you ask your most important?
Well, the first one is just... I'm curious what the percentage of single mothers, what is the percentage of single mothers who are teenage mothers, and what is the percentage who have chosen to be mothers? And
I'll give you that very quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, back in 1970, if you were to look at all of the births that happened out of wedlock, 50% of them would have happened to adolescents. If you look today at that same question, take all the births that are happening out of wedlock, which is about 1.2 million every year, only 30% of them are occurring to girls under the age of 20. So there's been a significant change in that 70% are now occurring to women over the age of 20. And if you then want to break that down even more and look at the ones potentially that are sort of these single mothers by choice, I would argue single mothers by second choice, over the age of 35, they then would be about 16% of that total. Today, back in 1970, they would have represented 8%. So there's been a doubling of that. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of how that lays out.
So the second part of my question was just that...
But these aren't single mothers. These are giving births out of wedlock, beginning family formation outside of marriage.
Right.
It doesn't take in divorce or separation,
Right, okay.
which you can add a larger.
That's true, yeah. I'm curious, it seems to me that this conversation has focused predominantly on teenage mothers, and it seems to me that the topic of unwed motherhood encompasses two very, very different kinds of situations. One is the really unfortunate case of teenage motherhood, which of course is a very important conversation, and I think it's been a really good and interesting conversation, and I don't at all want to belittle that, but it seems to me also that another very important piece is when healthy, emotionally and financially stable adult women are choosing to have children in a healthy way, and I guess I'm a little bit disappointed to find the focus of a talk on unwed motherhood being sort of only, I mean, it seems to imply that it's a problem instead of focusing on the challenges that people who are making a conscious, adult, healthy, stable choice to be mothers would make. So I'm curious to have you sort of comment more on that aspect rather than just sort of...
And let me ask Melissa if in doing that you would not only comment on the 16% who are over 35, but what must be the majority if I add 30 and 16, which is somewhere in between age 20 and age 35, not all of whom are tenured professors at Harvard Law School. And I think we shouldn't assume that anyone who is not a teenager is...
Most of whom are not. I mean, that is one of the things we should say. I mean, I focused on in my book on the youngest and the oldest of women, sort of in the reproductive spectrum in this area, primarily because that's where the public spotlight already was, for two reasons. One was because teenagers have always been a real sort of public concern in terms of parenting, and had been an increasing public concern because of the welfare reform debate. The other end of the spectrum was focused on primarily primarily because, frankly, Dan Quayle had brought them into the national spotlight with his sort of remarks about Murphy Brown. And so I took those two, what I thought were extremes, and I was kind of fascinated to find some common ground in those experiences. But there is a huge chunk in the middle. There is no age group, no group divided by educational, standing, no group divided by race that is not experiencing unmarried motherhood. And that should be said at the outset of this. One of the reasons I think the conversation has focused so much on teens tonight, well, one reason is we're sitting in the Kennedy School, which is a school of public policy. And there isn't a whole lot of public policy that, kind of what we think of as public policy, these grand legislation or programs or kind of governmental responses that exist in terms of our conversation about older mothers, because in many cases they're not reliant, on that. But I do think you raised a good point, and one that's worth thinking about. Most mothers, most women who become mothers by bearing a child out of wedlock are, as a general rule, less educated than the general population, probably less well off economically than the general population, have probably experienced different difficulties in their own family along the way to a larger degree than many in the rest of the population. So I think as a whole, we ought to be very concerned by the fact that these women who are perhaps least prepared among us to be parents within or outside of marriage, given their own preparations, their own sort of background, are taking on the most stressful job you can take on, which is try to be a parent on your own. And that is really a very, very, very huge concern. It ought to be a concern to all of us that that's happening.
I promised the mothers on our panel that we would get them home to their children at a reasonable hour, so I'm going to make this the last question.
My name is Diane O'Connor. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And I have worked for the last 8 years as a director of education at a small community clinic for teenagers. So I did a lot of sexuality education, and one of the things that it seems to me is that girls get involved in sexual relationships for lots of reasons, and one of the reasons is to keep a relationship together.
Yes.
And it appears to me that in most cases, at this early stage in their lives, they're not usually involved in what I would call really equal relationships. Most often their male partners are probably more dominant in the relationship. So we can teach girls to be assertive and to learn how to say no and to take care of themselves. But it seems to me we also have to have another message alongside it directed towards our young men, our sons, to be responsible in their behavior as well, that they can also refuse to have sex. They can also have responsible sex when they choose to do that. And give them some of the responsibility for sort of policing the sexual activity.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're doing something with Girl Scouts. I'd like to know what's being done for Boy Scouts.
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, in my book, there is a point at which I go and spend some time with some young fathers. And I did this because I thought it was just so important to understand their perspective in this. And what you learn from them, which I think is possible, again, the notion that if you listen to the young fathers long enough, you may learn something from them that could be of value in terms of transforming the way they see, their lives during this period of time. And I think what I learned mostly from my conversations with them and from my reading about them is that they suffer in just enormous pain in their lives from the absence of their fathers in their lives at a young age, and also as they continued to grow up. And if you spend time and you listen to them and let them talk about that and let them absorb their own sense of pain of this absence, and the fact that they then can be made to relate to this notion that if they go and produce a child that will also very likely not have them very present in their lives, that they are producing a situation for their child that is resembling the pain that they've experienced. I do think there's an opening. I think that for those who work and counsel boys, again, that process of listening to their own experiences in childhood, and then reflecting back to them the experiences that they may be creating as part of their entry into manhood, could possibly be a valuable, route as well.
I seem always to be a question behind, but I want to go back to the second part of the previous question, because I think, and maybe I misheard Melissa, but if I heard her right, then I think I disagree. I think there are tons of public policy issues surrounding the older single parent set of issues. I mean, this is a society in which kids are being raised by women, whether they're married, whether they're divorced, whether they enter into it as singles, older or younger. That's what's happening. And this is a society in which, as compared to other modern industrialized nations, we don't support parenting, single or coupled parenting. I think we've, got to take some lessons from Europe and, our own common sense and create a society where we've got decent parental leave. I mean, we think it's a huge advance in this country when we get unpaid parental leave. Well, I can't afford unpaid parental leave, and if I can't, who can? It's insane to think that's great progress. I mean, in Europe, there are countries where you get paid parental leave. You can be a part-time worker for, 6 years or something and get 2/3 of your previous wage. We gotta do a lot of things to make it possible to work and parent simultaneously, and particularly to make it possible for women to do those things. And it simply isn't today, unless you're basically superwoman, possible to do both those things well and productively and in a way that just doesn't grind you down.
Yeah.
So I think there's, lots of issues surrounding that, and we just don't have enough time because we live in a society that doesn't enable you to work and parent.
Yeah.
I actually think that's a very appropriate place to end, and I suspect Melissa does not disagree. I want to close by thanking the folks who sponsored this forum, the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee, the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and the Radcliffe Public Policy Institute. And I especially want to thank Melissa and Betsy and Carol in her absence for this very, very interesting and stimulating discussion. So thank you very, very much.
I think they're probably